Hi folks, and welcome to the second video lesson in our series on race and the oppositional gaze. This time we're going to transition from Manthia Diawara to Bell Hooks. Think about what she's doing as a response to spectatorship theory and as a response to Diawara. Her essay is entitled The Oppositional Gaze, which should remind you of Diawara's essay with the notion of resistant spectatorship. They're very much parallel theories, but Hooks will make a point and say that when she says oppositional, she means oppositional, which she thinks is a stronger term than merely resist. And it's actually a nice comparison. To resist something is much different than to oppose something. There's a lot more activity there in opposing. There's a lot more constructedness going on there. So I want us to think about that a little bit as we get into the connections between Diawara and Hooks. So what do they overlap on? I think there's a really important point. One of the points that I dwelled on in Diawara is this distinction he makes between spectators being socially and historically constituted as well as psychically constituted. Hooks says something very, very similar. And why this is important is because it's important for our class. These figures are not simply adding race to the equation of spectatorship. They're reflecting upon the blind spots of spectatorship as a set of theories more generally. I think that's super useful for us, which part of the goal of the class is to think about the patterns that are going on in how thinkers in film theory are theorizing. And Hooks and Diawara are doing that very thing. Hooks says, much like Diawara, the concept woman effaces the difference between women in specific socio-historical contexts, right? Remember that, social and historical. Between women defined precisely as historical subjects rather than as a psychic subject or non-subject. It is only as one imagines quote-unquote woman in the abstract, when woman becomes fiction or fantasy, can race not be seen as significant. So she's very much saying something similar to Diawara. Basically, it is a critique of the universality of these sets of theories. The tension between Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalysis as a theory for how we operate in the world does not have room for things like race as socially and historically constituted parts of who we are. And I think the fact that both Diawara and Hooks make this claim should give us at least one way to think about the difference between gender and race as it applies to these identity-centric theories of spectatorship. There are many ways gender and race do not operate in the same way, but one of the important ways, at least for Diawara and Hooks, is that the major theories that are guiding film theory at the time, remember that term Slav, Saussure, Lacan, Althusser, Barthes, or just think of the two larger figures that loom over them, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud. None of them bring race into the equation of how they explain subjectivity. Not in a significant way. Of course, there are Marxist and Freudian and Lacanian thinkers who talk about race. Diawara and Hooks are very much part of those camps, but they're responding to the lack of attention to race because things like gender have been so focused on a Freudian and Lacanian emphasis. Okay, so that's a brief acknowledgement of how Diawara and Hooks are agreeing with each other. But how does Hooks respond to Diawara? Remember that Diawara is going to say something like cinema makes you a white subject, not just a male subject, if he's responding to Mulvey. But Hooks will respond to Diawara and say cinema addresses you as a white male subject. Black female spectators are completely out of the equation. That's me paraphrasing her. So what do I mean by out of the equation? Well, I'm referring to this bit that she rehearses throughout the essay, and I think it's very useful to repeat. So she'll say something like this: those black female spectators who attest to the oppositionality of their gaze deconstruct theories of female spectatorship that have relied heavily on the assumption that, quote, and she's quoting fellow film theorist Marianne Doan, woman can only assume a position defined by the penis phallus as the supreme arbiter of lack, identifying with neither the phallocentric gaze nor the construction of white womanhood as lack, Critical black female spectators construct a theory of looking relations where cinematic visual delight is the pleasure of interrogation. If I had to find a couple sentences that really captures the grandest part of the thesis of Hook's essay, I'd say it was these sentences. What I think is crucial is that Hooks is responding to Laura Mulvey here. And she's responding to the Laura Mulveyan thinkers that would follow Mulvey, who would repeat very much the way in which she talks about sex and gender in a Freudian/Lacanian way. Why is it so important that black female spectators neither occupy the phallocentric gaze nor the construction of white womanhood as lack? Well, remember that Hooks, in a very brief aside, will say that black male spectators can, at the very least, feel addressed by the patriarchal structure of Hollywood film. That if Laura Mulvey is right, does play for the objectification of women by imagining a male heterosexual spectator, black men can at least fulfill that role under the cover of the anonymity of being a spectator. And she invokes the violence that has been done at black men casting a look upon white women. And at the very least, Hook says, in film, or in the space of the theater, there's a kind of safety or a feeling of. But Hooks is saying that black women, black female spectators, do not have that same possibility, nor are they even automatically positioned as the object of the white male gaze for a number of reasons. The reasons having to do with representation, the lack of representation, but more so the kind of specific ways in which black women figure in the history of Hollywood cinema, which she details throughout her essay. But I just want to take this point that she's making and think of what we would do with this if we were to say, look again at Laura Mulvey's individual points about the objectification of women. So remember this point that Laura Mulvey will make, where she'll say, classical films often have moments, and this is me paraphrasing, like these where the narrative is suspended so we can appreciate the spectacle of a woman performing. Consider this scene from Gilda. So it's a moment where we have the invocation of a male looker looking at the character Gilda perform, and it's also a bit of a striptease act as she's singing. Now, consider the way in which this kind of scene, which Mulvey talks about in her essay, is invoked in a film by Julie Dash. And we have this moment that in this fictional, fake Hollywood film from the 1940s, a musical, that Mulvey would say is a perfect example of stopping the narrative for the sake of male visual pleasure, right? We have these glowing close-ups of this white singer. Now, what Dash is partly trying to do, and she's doing quite a bit with this extraordinary sequence, she's trying to make us think about the other kind of subjugation that's happening. If for Mulvey, this scene would be a perfect instance of the objectification of women that works to kind of structure the relationship between spectacle and narrative in Hollywood cinema, Julie Dash is trying to show us that within the institution of cinema, a sequence like this could have a hidden subjugation behind it. That is the fact that the voice that is emanating from this white movie star's mouth is not her own, and is in fact the voice of a young black woman who will not have her name in the credits. That this woman's talents, her voice, are going to be used, instrumentalized, and that the apparatus of cinema, which always has a detachment between sound and image baked into its very materiality, allows for this kind of subjugation to happen. So Hooks will remind us that just as in this film Illusions, part of the problem is the lack of representation of black women on screen and the instrumentalization of black women behind the screen, Hooks will make that point clear here. She'll say, most of the black women I talked with were adamant that they never went to movies expecting to see compelling representations of black femaleness. They were all acutely aware of cinematic racism, its violent erasure of black womanhood. In Friedberg's essay, A Denial of Difference, she stresses that, quote, identification can only be made through recognition. And all recognition is itself And all recognition is itself an implicit confirmation of the ideology of the status quo. Even when representations of black women were present in film, our bodies and being were there to serve, to enhance and maintain white womanhood as object of the phallocentric gaze. So that's a perfect example. That sentence is a perfect example of what's going on here. To enhance and maintain white womanhood as object of the phallocentric gaze. What else is going on in this sequence other than the use of a black woman to enhance and maintain white womanhood as this perfect, idealistic, unreal figure of feminine beauty and charm? It uses the illusory qualities of cinema to give her qualities that are not part of who she is as an actual person, that is the white actress. Her voice is enhanced by taking the voice of this black woman, right? And this idea of appropriation, of taking, of admiring and then objectifying and having admiration and objectification fold into each other is very much the theme of how black men are appropriated in the film Get Out. So in our next video, we'll be looking at a couple questions that Bell Hooks asks with respect to the specificity of the film Get Out. Primarily, we'll be asking, what about the black female characters in Get Out? How would Hooks respond to them? And secondly, what about the theme of looking and the gaze, which is so central to Hooks and so central, I think, to Get Out? We'll see you next time.